Welcome back. When we talk about inclusive prosperity, what's top of mind is usually the 40-plus years of wage stagnation for the bottom 90% American earners that began in the mid-1970s. It's been the primary driver of today's record levels of inequality, and University of Massachusetts economist Arin Dube has spent a significant portion of his career studying what caused that pay gap, which began with a decoupling of wage growth from productivity growth and ways to address it. In fact, he's been called the go-to guy on minimum wages by Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman. Now Dube has a new book titled The Wage Standard: What's Wrong in the Labor Market and How to Fix It, where he argues that U.S. wage stagnation has not been about irresistible economic or societal forces, but instead mostly about policy choices. Among those choices has been a reluctance among politicians to raise the minimum wage, and that includes the federal minimum wage, which he says at $7.25 per hour is so low that it's functionally like having no minimum at all. His research has gone a long way to dispelling stubborn myths about minimum wages that have persisted despite growing empirical evidence to the contrary, but also to explain other forces driving employment monopsony, the condition where a small number of employers effectively control the market for jobs and pay. To address those forces, Dube advocates for a number of measures, ranging from trading slightly higher inflation for tighter labor markets to sectoral bargaining and stronger unions. I'm Ralph Fernelli, your host for the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity podcast. And Arin Dube is here with us today. So let's get to it. Arin, it's nice to see you. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So your recent book is called The Wage Standard: What's Wrong in the Labor Market. And I really like how you're taking a deep dive in how the labor market really works, because to me it seems like we talk about the labor market a lot, like incessantly almost, but it seems like we do so with so little understanding. Just to start, how would you characterize the general level of knowledge about the labor market? Would you say it's one of the least understood parts of the economy, perhaps one of the most misunderstood, where people have conceptions about it, but they're not necessarily correct, or even the most represented or most misrepresented by, actors who may have something to gain from that lack of understanding? What would your characterization be?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, if you think about it, it's a market that most of us have some familiarity with if you have a job, which most of us do. So we have experience in it. We see around us how we get paid, but then we are left with different stories about why we get paid what we do, have the jobs that we have. And so to make sense of that lived experience and that understanding, it's important to have some basic framework to think about, like, well, why am I getting paid what I'm getting paid? For example, one is that, well, there's supply of workers, and then there's demand. And surely that's important. But if that's the only thing that's important, then, well, if there are certain types of workers who are getting paid more, it's because their skills are in greater demand. And if we are not happy about that, well, then we should make sure that more people have those skills that are in demand. So that's one way of thinking about it. But that basically, that approach essentially tells us that there aren't so much as good jobs and bad jobs. They're just maybe workers with low skills and high skills. And we just need to do something to maybe augment skills, improve education, and so forth. All important things, mind you. But I think I would argue incomplete as an understanding. So in contrast, what my book sort of lays out is that what people earn what they earn is not just an accident, and it's not inevitable, that it's a product of choices. But to make sense of that statement, that it's a product of choices, we need to have a different model in mind of the labor market. And I think that's partly what I'm trying to do. Is the good news is that there's at this point, a large body of literature in economics that has emerged, like relatively recently, by the way, especially in the last 10 years, that have, I think, added substantially to our understanding how the labor market actually works. This is not just a kind of like a interesting ivory tower observation. This actually has a lot of relevance for thinking about practical things about how people get paid and what we can practically do to give more workers a raise, which is the central value proposition of my book, that American workers deserve a raise. And the way I can make sense of that is by starting with a framework for understanding the labor market where there are more choices. This sort of goes by a funny name in economics called monopsony, but
Right.
the key idea is very straightforward. It's that employers have a degree of discretion in setting pay, that it's not simply pinned down by market forces of supply and demand, but actually companies have some discretion. And how they use that discretion is really depends on a variety of environmental factors. Everything from the state of the macroeconomy to labor market institutions like collective bargaining or the minimum wage or public pressure, or even interesting things like what kind of CEO did they hire?
Right.
These are the
Right.
stories that I try to tell in the book to try to make sense of this pay setting, which is really central as a starting point if we're going to then think about what kind of policies work, what don't work, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, I definitely want to get into all those little areas, those little weeds. But I was kind of hoping to set the scene right now because I'm almost, so my cohort, my age cohort is almost sort of a poster child for the labor market that I think is the lived experience of a lot of us because I sort of entered the labor market back in the early 1980s. And I'm sort of closing in towards maybe being approaching retirement age. But that was really the start of this divergence that you talk about in um, in productivity between productivity and wages,
Yeah.
right? And you say that by 2019, if they had grown together, median wages would be like something like $33 an hour. Um, and you actually pitch in your story like you deserve a raise, and that's because of this gap. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that gap and what what was sort of the period before, which I think is something we call the Great Compression, which we did a show about not too long ago. But talk about the period before that, and then a little bit of this historical period that kind of we've experienced over the last 4 decades.
Yeah. So here's the starting point. Between 1980 and 2019, the productivity of the American economy grew by 73%. So just like how much stuff do we produce in an hour of work? Okay. Wages at the top grew by something similar, or maybe a bit, some around that. Not too far off, but the wages at the middle, the median wage, grew by only 23%. At the bottom, even less so, 17% at the 10th percentile. So we have this disjuncture between what the productivity of the overall economy is doing and what wages for most workers are doing. And so, this is striking, but then it does raise the question, is this sort of just something that always happens? And it's always happened. It's just nature of capitalism or some such. But it turns out that's not true. In fact, we have experienced very different periods in our history. And in particular, in between 1948 and 1979, for example, wages across the board tracked overall productivity fairly closely. And then it sort of broke in the 1980s. And this break is particularly strong in the United States compared to many other peer countries. And so the key point of the book, this is the starting point, is that this was not inevitable, this divergence, this period of great divergence. It was not simply a market outcome. You know,
Right, because I think you mentioned the fact that the difference between the U.S. and the other countries, and I think some people have tried to explain it away as, oh, it's about the advancements of technology and technological enhancements for productivity, or it's globalization. But if that were true, right, you wouldn't have these differences between the U.S. and other industrialized nations.
exactly. You know, it's interesting because last week I spent most of last week in Sweden. I actually talked about, amongst other things, my book there. And Sweden is a very interesting place to talk about these issues because it provides a stark contrast when it comes to wages. Swedish wage gap between the 10th and the 90th percentile has hovered around 2 times. Okay, so basically those at the 90th percentile make roughly 2 times more than those at the 10th percentile. That's one of the smallest gaps in high income economies. And it has changed very little. It's rose a little bit, but not much. At the same time, in the United States, that gap has grown tremendously, sort of reaching sort of about 5 times, in sort of the height of in 2010s. So that's a very interesting and useful contrast because if we think that there's forces of technology and globalization that are affecting different countries, then we would expect similar outcomes when it comes to wage inequality, and that's just not been true. We've seen a lot of differences, including in the Swedish example. And a key reason for that turns out to be collective bargaining, where basically wages in Sweden are set like, almost 90% of jobs have wages that are set through collective bargaining, and that puts very strong limits on how much wages could actually fall. And that has played a critical role. And what's not happened in the United States, as I argue in the book, is exactly that type of standard setting. In fact, what we have seen is a reduction in union density from maybe 35% in the 1950s to in the private sector today about 5%.
Yeah,
And
there's in Sweden is just a question about Sweden and the and unionization. Um, I was reading about that there's a difference between union membership, actual union membership, and union coverage,
that's right.
and that's the amount of people actually members of a union versus the amount of people whose salaries are set by some sort of collective and bargaining agreement, but they're not necessarily members of the union. How is that different in Sweden versus in other countries who
Yeah,
are sort of similarly situated versus how it is here?
exactly. So, an even better example for that particular issue is to actually go to a different European country, France, because here's the reason. France and United States overall have about 10% of our workforces are unionized. As I said, in it's 5% in the private sector, but in the public plus private sector, it's about 10%. That may seem surprising. Really? I thought the France were more unionized. But here's the thing. In the United States, about 10% of jobs are covered by a collective bargaining contract, same as membership. In France, it's like 98% are covered by a collective
Wow.
bargaining contract because what happens is unions and employer federation negotiate nationally served by and come up with sectoral agreements that are then applied to most companies. Doesn't matter if you're a union member or not, your job has a particular standard. You could you could negotiate to get paid higher than that, but you
Right.
can be paid lower than that. And this sectoral standard, similar also in Sweden, though there's the differences in Sweden, union membership is also much higher for interesting reasons. The Nordic countries have generally kept membership high, including by having what's called the Ghent system, where unions play a role in the sort of management of unemployment benefits, etc. But in So there are different sort of details, but generally speaking, the coverage of jobs across most of our high income peer countries by collective bargaining is just a lot higher than here in the United States, where even in the heyday of unionization, like, I talk about in the book, sort of a famous, the Fortune magazine called a collective bargaining agreement, the Treaty of Detroit. This was the
In
1950.
1950, right, right,
Treaty of Detroit was basically agreement between the United Auto Workers and the big three automakers.
right,
Now, this was relevant because it really sort of was the iconic wage and benefit standard that really governed the post-war era and really helped build the middle class in many ways in this country. So that Treaty of Detroit, sort of setting standards, it wasn't just for the union members themselves that were directly affected. Indirectly, it ended up sort of affecting workers that are outside of the unionized workplace, and those spillovers were important. But different from the European context, those were all sort of happened more informally, and
right,
it wasn't like a sectoral agreement that was formalized, or certainly no
right,
extension of contracts by statute, like, for example, in France, or Switzerland and other places that actually occurred. So when union membership fell in this country, it also meant the share of jobs that have anything to do with collectively bargained wages also declined, in the same fashion. And
right.
that led to, a lot of really sort of good research showing how important that was in sort of the increase in inequality and reduction in pay for those in kind of the bottom and the middle of the wage distribution.
So talk about frictions a little bit, because I think it was helpful to me in terms of understanding.
Yeah, so I think when we think about the labor market, it's useful to think about, well, there's these forces of supply and demand, but then there are things that maybe, sort of don't quite work out that way, something that stops it. And so what is that? So those are what in economics we often refer to as frictions. So one example is what prevents, for example, this sort of hyper competition between employers, right? That would sort of push up wages until, and because after all, if a company is paying lower than its competitors, workers could quit, right? They could just quit and go to the better paying competitor. Why don't they? Because it turns out that they often are not able to. And that's an example of frictions, maybe things that are preventing flow of workers from one place to another. And that basically creates puddles, if you will, of jobs. The same way why water doesn't just flow from, higher to lower elevation if there's something that like a barrier that creates a puddle. That basically is sort of a metaphor for what kind of frictions actually occur in the labor market. And that sort of, prevents this competitive force to, fully taking over. And so, in a world where are such frictions, sort of having countervailing power is quite important. And so that's the way sort of, I talk about in the book, is that when you have a degree of employer monopsony power, for example, for having this due to, say, search frictions, and then what we have is a countervailing power, for example, in the presence of union, that sort of pushes back against that. And that sort
Right.
of reestablish a better equilibrium, in light of in presence of such frictions that may otherwise tend to push wages down.
Yeah, you and Isan Bastier and Suresh Naidu did some research on how changes in pay translated into willingness or unwillingness to leave a job.
Yeah.
And some of the findings I think were a little bit surprising, at least to me. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I think, again, the starting point is, imagine there are two companies, like one is paying higher than another. Let me actually just be very concrete. Let's take two major retailers in the US, Walmart and Target. Turns out, Target pays about 25% higher than Walmart. So the question is that really reflecting pay differences for similar workers? And the answer turns out to be that to a sizable extent, yes. But then why aren't workers in Walmart quitting and taking jobs at Target, right? Like, so how you would think that in a sort of a fully competitive market, that process would essentially force Walmart to raise its wage and equalize to the targets. But
Right.
that
If there was a supply and demand, real supply and demand market.
exactly. So it
Yeah.
would but that doesn't seem to happen. So the question is why not? And more generally, what's this quitting process actually like? So it turns out what when employers actually pay somewhat higher, quit rates do fall, but not nearly as much as you may think. So in my research with Isan Basir and Suresh Naidu, what we did is we used sort of matched employer-employee data and track workers as they went from job to job and sort of say, okay, let's imagine two very similar workers with basically the same biography. One lands at Target and then the other lands at Walmart, right? They used to be the same jobs before, et cetera. How long are they staying at these jobs? And when do they end up quitting and going somewhere else? So it turns out that paying again 10% higher pay leads to maybe 1 to 2% lower quits. So important reduction, but not nearly enough to really get to this competitive market story that you would expect, because quits would actually just have to go up dramatically more to really establish that competition.
What are some of the frictions on employees that prevent them from quitting, and that you don't necessarily think about, that prevent that from being a more sort of responsive supply and demand market?
Yeah. So, this is sort of where we want to think about what's preventing workers. One possibility is that maybe there aren't that many employers that are competing for those workers. So this is a classic sort of example of concentration. So in many local labor markets, there turn out to be only more of a handful of employers for a given role in a given occupation. We've actually found that markets are surprisingly more concentrated than we may have actually thought. So interesting work by Ioana Marinescu and co-authors show that in the typical American labor market, it's about as concentrated as having 3 equally sized employers, which is not very much.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's pretty much monopsony right there, right?
Right. Now, but of course, this is the typical market, maybe in a sort of a mid-sized town, a mid-city or smaller or larger town. But what about in more dense markets like in Boston or New York? Well, it turns out this is where search frictions become really important, because it turns out finding a job, especially when you already have another job, is costly, slow, exhausting. There are information issues. There's also just the sort of affective and emotional aspect of changing jobs. And then jobs aren't always interchangeable. They may look the same on paper, but maybe your commute is longer than mine. I get along better with my coworkers or my supervisor. My kid's daycare is pretty close by. All those may mean that I could actually continue to work here. I may agree to continue to work here, even for somewhat lower pay. All of that basically leads employers to basically have this choice of trade-off. Like, well, I could pay a higher wage and I could get some more workers and have less workers quit, but only sort of moderately so. So then I can sort of decide exactly where along that spectrum of wages I may actually choose to set wages. But then on top of that, there's what I call monopsony by artifice. And this is where employers sort of deliberately add friction.
Right.
So some examples of this are, for example, no poach agreements. Now there's some there's some pretty interesting examples. One of my favorite examples from the book is this. In 2009, the Department of Justice opened an investigation into a secret no poach agreement among Silicon Valley's some of the biggest names like Apple, Google, Adobe, Intel, and others. This was an explicit agreement not to recruit each other's employees. And so the evidence actually included emails from Steve Jobs, then CEO of Apple himself. When a Google recruiter contacted an Apple engineer, Jobs then emailed Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO at the time of
Right.
Google. I would be very pleased if the recruiting department would stop doing this. And so Schmidt promised that the recruiter would be terminated within the hour.
Right.
And Steve Jobs then replied with only a single smiley face. And so that smiley face is really kind of the face
Yeah.
of monopsony by artifice. And so these are not
Right.
small companies, these are major employers. And interesting research sort of found what happened is that after the DOJ opened the investigation, this was just completely illegal. So they
Yeah. It's a collusion, right?
it's pure collusion. So the investigation basically ended the collusive agreement, and sort of the research shows that in fact that led to substantial wage growth once the collusion actually ended.
Wow.
And so this monopsony by artifice is also just not just a Silicon Valley story.
Right. It reaches down, right? I mean,
Yeah,
through NDAs.
exactly. So it turns out that 1 in 5 American workers were bound by non-compete agreements, and these include
Right. Non-competes, not NDAs.
yeah, these include companies that like Jimmy John's sandwich shop. So the interesting thing is these non-competes are historically justified as protecting trade secrets. Like, so if you don't go work for a competitor because you'll take like, how this software is made or some not clear what the trade secret is for Jimmy John's, maybe the secret sauce that, the sandwich had.
God forbid that it should go to Jersey Mike's, right?
Yeah. So I think that clearly the main purpose was basically to eliminate the worker's next best outside option and just create, difficulty actually finding jobs. Interestingly, some states ban non-competes, including California. And so it was not actually accidental that this no poach agreement happened in California because they couldn't actually have workers sign non-compete. So then they decided just to do something strictly illegal. Now, this is very important because, we have a number of states that have passed various types of, sort of ways of preventing non-competes. And then in 2024, the Federal Trade Commission moved to ban most non-competes nationwide. This was a big deal, but it was challenged in court, and the present administration has opted not to actually defend it. And so at this point, it's pretty much not clear what the rule is. But going forward, this is an easy thing to fix. We talk about frictions. Some frictions, and I argued, like the sort of are really endemic to the work process and the labor market. It's very hard to get rid of search friction. You can reduce, but you're not going to. But there's some frictions like non-competes that are absolutely things that are within our policy power, and we should do what we can to make it easier for workers to actually move jobs and find alternatives.
Now, in terms of employers, we already talked about labor unions, um, but I did want to get into minimum wage laws because that's something you've done a lot of work on. It's also something that I think is sort of controversial, but but maybe more so than it should be, given the because it seems to me like a bit head scratching. It seems to me because we have empirical examples in the real world of higher minimum wage laws going in places like Seattle, and the doom and gloom predictions not coming true about job loss and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about this body of empirical evidence now that we have on minimum wage laws, and kind of set the record straight as you see it in terms of the effect of minimum wage laws?
Yeah. So, the history of this body of research really dates from something that's a dysfunction in the way we set minimum wages in this country. So between 19, you know, 30, from the 1930s until like 1980 or so, the federal minimum wage was updated regularly. And again, that kept up with median wage, with the productivity overall, et cetera. But then starting in 1980, we didn't raise the minimum wage at all during the Reagan administration, so for 8 years. And that was for the first time that happened. And that led to significant increase in inequality by reducing wages at the bottom. But it led also to some states to step in for the first time and raise their own minimum wage. And this is actually what created, in some ways, natural experiments that you can study. For example, New Jersey raised its minimum wage in 1992. Neighboring Pennsylvania did not. Well, two economists, David Card and Alan Kruger, had the idea to say, well, hey, guys, we know we could see what actually happens. Why don't we go like survey fast food restaurants in New Jersey and in Eastern Pennsylvania and see, and then see what happens after they pass and go ask them again. Did they raise wages? Did they reduce employment? And it turns out what they found really kind of shook up the profession, because they found that, in fact, employment didn't actually fall in New Jersey compared to Pennsylvania. But of course, it was a very controversial study, and people argued that maybe they got the data wrong, they had bad data, maybe something was going on quirky. And so this led to, of course, a follow-up work and at this point, a large body of literature. What's interesting in that large body of literature is that we've also now currently going through sort of the natural experiment sort of on, I don't know, natural experiment on crack or whatever is because we have now gone for 17 years without raising the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 today.
Right.
$7.25 is so low that it is like having no minimum wage at all, because most states, almost all employers and almost everywhere in the United States today pay more than $7.25. So it's sort of useless. What's interesting is we have 20 states that do not have any state minimum wages. So that's the only floor, $7.25. Yeah. Basically, we have roughly half the country that today, for the first time since the 1930s, have no effective minimum wage at all. In contrast, we have 30 states that have raised the minimum wage, and some of them have raised quite substantially so. So over the last 17 years, we've been running a very sort of striking natural experiment where half the country, no minimum wage at this point, the other half sometimes substantially higher. And we can look and see what's happened. And, so I actually just recently did a blog post on this, just to look, you can track exactly, this doesn't require any sophisticated analysis, really. You can just look up the data. For example, what happened to restaurant employment, which is a high impact sector per capita in these two groups of states. And it turns out, what happened to restaurant wages? It turns out restaurant wages have risen substantially more in these 30 states than the other 20 states. Restaurant employment has basically been the same. And so it is really striking that we have ran this natural experiment, and that has led to a much, I think, richer understanding of what actually minimum wage policies do. So I talk about broadly at this point in the literature. Look, you are going to find studies that say that they found a more negative effect. There are other ones that say more positive effect. If you take the body of literature overall, it suggests an average employment effect that's very close to zero. Okay, and that's and if you look at studies that were done in the last 10 years, it's virtually like not different from zero. And but I think at the same time there's a sort of a strong tendency, especially amongst more sort of motivated, like restaurant lobby or something like that, to really sort of cherry pick and find studies that sort of support their case. But at this point, it's pretty hard to look at the data and, not sort of come away with the conclusion that you can use a variety of statistical tools, et cetera, but including the simplest ones that pretty much point to the fact that the minimum wage has been an effective policy. And this is not just, by the way, in the United States. Other countries, have increasingly seen take more ambitious minimum wages. Just to give you a sense, a lot of times when you compare across countries, we look at the minimum wage as a relative to the median wage in that area or the country. So in the U.S. today, of course, the federal minimum wage is like 25% of the median wage. It's like U.S. is an outlier, but historically, maybe in 2000, if you look at across the OECD countries, it was maybe about 50% of the median wage. Today, it's more like 60%. So we've seen across, across the high income economies, an increasing experimentation with higher minimum wages, like we have seen in part of the United States. Like, for example, California and Arizona and a few other states, it's close to 60% of the median, which is similar to our peer countries. So I think that this body of literature has been very useful, and I think policymakers have used it to sort of think about, where to set the minimum wage.
So, Arin, aside from minimum wage laws, we also talked about societal norms, social pressures. You've also found something very interesting about sort of the nature of who the CEOs are, maybe these days before who they used to be back years ago, and maybe what their training and their background is. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So, one of the things about labor market where employers have some discretion is that different kinds of pay strategies can emerge. But, one question is, where do they come from? Like, what pay strategies? We don't know. Like norms. Norms are a hard thing to measure, because fundamentally they may be about ideas. And, so how do we actually go about studying that? So really interesting research sort of looks at what happens when a company hires a CEO who has a business school degree. So why does this matter? Well, business schools starting in the late 70s and in the 80s really sort of had a change in some approaches in thinking about what should businesses do. And this is sometimes called sort of the shareholder value revolution. So the idea that, the goal of the business should be, to maximize shareholder returns. And that means, well, what else can they do? Well, because they could potentially also pay attention to other stakeholders. And that stakeholders people who have some stake in the company include, of course, workers, not just people who are owners of capital. But the shareholder value revolution was really important. And if you were doing an MBA in the 1980s, you would hear a lot about it. So if you got hired to be the CEO and you were to implement some of the things that you learned in the classroom, it may lead to a pretty different outcome. So one question is, does it? Well, again, in a model of supply and demand, there's no real room for a CEO's beliefs. It's like, well, great, you have these beliefs, but really matters is supply and demand. But in a world where employers have some discretion, maybe beliefs matter. So does it? Turns out when a company hires a CEO for the first time with a business school degree, it leads to about a 6% reduction in pay, even larger, like 9% for blue-collar workers. And this is very sharp. You can compare these companies versus others that didn't, track over time, very clear evidence that this happened. So while maybe that's just reflecting that these CEOs are also just really better at managing the company, and that cuts cost and raises productivity, but that doesn't happen either. It turns out there's no impact on productivity. There is higher profits and there is higher CEO compensation. So it's a pure transfer. But what's important about this is because this actually gives us a lens to sort of think about and understand how sort of ideology, right, about how we should pay people, how you should get paid, really can play a critical role in driving pay and pay gap between either high and low end workers, or between workers and the owners of capital. And that is a key part, I think, of the story that I tell in the book, that these are choices. We're making different choices, and that can have a big impact on workers' lives.
And you really get into these sort of moral notions of fairness, right? Defining what fairness is, what obligations companies maybe have to the notion of fairness. Because it seems to me we don't spend enough time talking about things like this, right? We have, in some ways, I think companies want to be part of the social contract. They want to be involved in politics, and you have these Supreme Court decisions that say things like, well, money is speech, and corporations are sort of a version of people. But if corporations are going to have that, companies are going to have those sort of rights within the social contract, shouldn't they also have the responsibilities of fairness, right? And so you have this sort of Walmart effect, which I think is the extreme example of that, where you have essentially employees who have to rely on public assistance, and taxpayers pay for that public assistance they have to rely on. So that's a de facto transfer to these companies that pay like very low wages. So how do you sort of figure fairness into the equation? What does fairness mean to you as applied to this whole area? What do you think is appropriate?
Yeah, so I think it's a useful thing to think about what kind of responsibilities should corporations have. And so this is what goes back to the discussion about shareholders versus stakeholders, right? So if we think that basically companies are not simply there to, or shouldn't be there to, maximize returns for owners of capital, but a lot of people are sort of tied to the company. And this actually comes out of the notion that if it's hard to change jobs, I can't simply just snap my finger and move and get another job easily. And workers, by the way, if you go survey workers, most workers say that it's actually not easy to find a job even as good as their current ones, even when they're at a low-paying company like Walmart. So in that case, you're to a degree, tied to a workplace. It's sticky, just like, so it's not just owners of capital, but other people as well. So in that case, it makes sense to think about what's an arrangement that is fair to a variety of individuals involved. And, at a certain level, of course, fairness is a social construct. And really what sort of matters is what kind of, sort of value system can we create under that sort of guides the broader pay setting process. What's interesting is sort of thinking about the arc of this. Of course, in many ways, these fairness norms were really established in sort of they're forged in the fire of union organizing and conflict of the 30s and 40s, that sort of prior to this Treaty of Detroit example. And then those sort of eroded over as in the 70s and 80s, and their shareholder value revolution, the emergence of new companies like Walmart, which really had no union presence and originated from a relatively lower wage areas. So it created a new set of norms, and that sort of, I think, eroded some of the fairness concerns and the idea that you share profits with your workers. So that all sort of started to erode. Back in the 1980s, if you asked, like, if you joined a large company, did you get a higher pay? The answer would be across the board, yes. You could be a blue collar worker, white collar worker. Larger companies that tended to be more productive shared more of their, the income earnings with workers. That's continued to be true for white collar workers, but stopped being the case for blue collar workers and by early 2000s. But then something interesting happened is that there was growing concern that in this country wages are not really keeping up, especially for workers in the middle and the bottom of the distribution. There were pressure to talk about fairness, that this is unfair. Companies should do better. And, something interesting happened. In 2014, Gap became the first company to establish a voluntary minimum wage. And so that led to reporters then sort of ask other companies like Walmart, like, are you going to do the same thing? It was a $9 at the time minimum wage. The federal minimum wage was $7.25, so this was a bit above. Well, Walmart first said, no, we're not. We're just going to let the market sort of guide pay. But within a few months, they said, actually, we're also going to do $9 minimum wage. And not only that, then Target and other companies, eventually Amazon became the first company to have a $15 voluntary minimum wage. Again, this was a combination of outside pressure. For example, there were efforts at organizing that was going on. Bernie Sanders was out there talking about, Walmart is, and Amazon should be paying more. It's unfair. And those led to establishing sort of these pay voluntary floors. And this was not just cheap talk. Really sort of high quality research is now sort of shown. This led to very substantial wage increases for workers at these companies, retailers, banks, like Bank of America. And this ended up raising wages for maybe 3 to 4 million workers. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that this was an important sort of example of not just things getting worse, but there's things that we can do to improve. And the book is really not a gloom and doom book. It actually has a lot of examples of how we have done better and increasing pay in many ways, not just simply lower pay, although that's been a dominant sort of direction in so many years in the last 4 decades. But that is an example of a success. At the same time, I say that this highlights some limitations as well, because even though 3 to 4 million is a lot of workers, it's a relatively small share of the overall workplace. And so one of the things I say, if we have these concerns and fairness concerns that we want to take to scale, we need to really think about how we can build standards more broadly, certainly starting with a strong minimum wage, but also thinking about setting wage floors but using sectoral standards. And we've started to see experimentation of this in a number of states. For example, healthcare sector in Minnesota and California, that could build sort of similar standards like we see in high-income peer countries, be it Sweden or France, that we discussed. And so I think there's a lot that we have learned about how we can do better, and that we can have a fair system of pay and income. And so that's sort of what the book really sort of highlights, and the possibilities of that of more inclusive prosperity.
Right. And I think you've also said that you need to approach it kind of in a holistic way, with some macro solutions and some micro solutions, and I think you even called it meso solutions, like solutions in the middle. Can you just talk about that a little bit, and also maybe ways to sort of, in your mind, you think political viability can be worked into the equation and sort of help make this more of a reality in the real world?
So I think that a key aspect of building a strong wage standard is to start with thinking about what kind of a macroeconomy, and the answer here is actually pretty clear, that a prioritization of full employment is really critical. We actually did that more in the period, in the 50s, 60s than we did than we have in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. Interestingly, we've actually had some more success on that in the last 10 years. And not surprisingly, the last 10 years in the United States has actually produced better wage growth, real wage growth, than it had in the 40 years prior. A lot of the wage growth in the last 50 years has happened in a handful of periods with tight labor markets. And that's a really critical lesson for us to remember. But the macro is only one part of the picture. We also, I talk about the micro, which is the examples of the companies and the voluntary wage standards, et cetera, pressure But in the middle lie sort of things that are more in the meso realm, which is really kind of policies, be it minimum wages, but also the sectoral standards that I just mentioned, including in healthcare sector in Minnesota and California, childcare in Washington State. I think that we can and should really try to improve wages in the middle of the distribution, because those workers have not seen wage growth if you take the longer perspective. And in terms of political viability, look, I think that it's critical for us to remember that when it comes to raising wages, people in this country agree that there's a lot of things we don't agree on and argue really about, but when it comes to raising wages, there's a broad-based support. Interestingly, every time the minimum wage is put on a ballot initiative, just about all the time it actually passes, including in red states, be it like Nebraska, purple states like Arizona, and in fact, just in 2 weeks from now, voters in Oklahoma will decide whether to raise their minimum wage. We'll see what happens. But this is something that is, broadly speaking, there's broad support for policies that have to do with raising minimum wages, but also generally raising wages more broadly. So I'm hopeful, not hopeful in the sense that I think everything will work out, but we know what we need to do. We have the evidence, and we know that these are popular policies. So I think political leadership is about mobilizing, the right coalition that actually brings about things that voters want and that we know, based on the science, are actually feasible for actually, having broad-based prosperity.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. And I know I feel like we've only scratched the surface on a lot of the really interesting things that you've said in your book. So the book is called The Wage Standard, What's Wrong with the Labor Market. I'd encourage anyone listening or watching to get a copy and dive in. And Arin, thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time with us.
It was my pleasure. Thanks very much.
This podcast is a production of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, a network of leading economists looking beyond neoliberalism and economic nationalism to answer the question, how do we build a more inclusive, more sustainable, and more prosperous economy for everyone? The co-directors of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity Network are Danny Roderick, Suresh Naidu, Stephanie Stancheva, Atif Mian, and Ilyana Kuzhenko. Our show is produced in collaboration with the Reimagining the Economy project at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Tony Ditta is our co-producer, and our social media coordinator is Violet Van Buckman. Please join us again in 2 weeks for another new episode. And if you like our content, please share us on social media, and remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your favorite podcasting app.